You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. It's time to see what's making the headlines with the director of the Demos think tank, Polly Mackenzie, and the deputy editor of Conservative Home, Henry Hill. And they'll be with us from now until just before midnight. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. The Times reports that Conservative MP Neil Parish, who today was named as the politician who viewed pornography on his phone in the House of Commons, is being urged to resign by colleagues. He claims he opened a link by accident. The Telegraph has word of Mr Parish's refusal to quit, while The Guardian says that he now faces an inquiry by the Parliamentary Standards Watchdog. The Eye has spoken to the staff member who a parliamentary inquiry found was bullied by the Labour MP Liam Byrne. He insists that victims of MPs' bad behaviour are too scared to report them. The Mail understands that Tory ministers are urging police in Durham to re-examine allegations that the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, and his deputy, Angela Rayner, socialised and drank together in breach of COVID regulations last year. The Mirror leads with the prison sentence handed to legendary tennis champion Boris Becker today, after he was found guilty of concealing his assets to avoid paying off his debts. That story is also on the front of The Sun. The Financial Times hears that HSBC is under pressure to split its Asian and Western business operations. And a reminder that by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And tonight we're joined by Polly Mackenzie and Henry Hill. Welcome to you both. Good to see you. Let's start with the Times and Neil Parish pictured on the front of the Times there, and also with the story that his Tory peers are telling him to go. Henry.
Yeah, I mean, it's not remotely surprising that Conservative MPs would dearly like this man to resign, given that this story has broken merely a week before the local elections, in which the Conservative Party is already expecting, I think, to take quite punishing losses in local authorities all over the country. Now, his line is that he has referred himself to the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards. He says that if she finds him guilty, he will resign, but he is insisting that that process must be allowed to take its course and that in the meantime, he will continue to perform his duties as Member of Parliament. Now, as a sort of matter of HR, that does seem reasonable. You know, these processes are in place. He has the right to avail himself of them as much as anybody else. But from a political perspective, it would definitely be sort of much easier for the party if he bit the bullet.
What say you, Polly?
Well, it's an extremely distressing story that's been running for a couple of days. I'm glad that Neil Parish has come forward and admitted that he is the MP about whom this allegation was made, because there was a danger that if it continued to run on, all of that speculation and the sense that basically all MPs were being kind of tarred with this sense of toxic sexual abuse. So it's good that now this is narrowed down to one individual. I think Henry's right that he has to have the opportunity to put his case forward. We don't know the detailed circumstances here. You know, there's a very strong prima facie case, including evidence from two female MPs that they saw him, as they described, watching porn. But I don't know about you. I have received completely unwanted kind of spam into WhatsApp groups or Twitter DMs of, you know, both male and female genitalia. Completely took me by surprise. Horrific. If that is what happened to him, then perhaps he can be forgiven. Perhaps he should be concentrating a little harder in the House of Commons. But he does need to be able to put that story forward. The reality, though, is that this story kind of comes on top of just a whole series of horrific allegations about MPs, but Conservative MPs in particular. There are now 4 who have lost the Conservative whip since the last general election as the result of accusations of sexual misconduct. You know, that feels like a cultural problem that spreads beyond simply what happened in those moments on Neil Parish's phone.
And Henry, that piles the pressure even more on him, with colleagues saying that there's a quote here that he's got to go, and if he doesn't, we've got to get rid of him.
It does, although the mechanisms for getting rid of an MP are rightly, given the sort of special role that they have, are very limited. The Conservative Party can withdraw the whip, which means that he will no longer count as a Conservative MP, and if that situation persists until the next election, he will not be able to stand for his seat again as a Conservative, which will mean he probably ends up leaving Parliament. But rightly, the Tory party can't kick him out of the House of Commons because he was put there by his constituents, and there are limited means by which constituents themselves can recall him. So a lot of these stories, one of the things that is quite frustrating, both from a political sort of management angle and indeed from a moral angle, is that there are limited avenues by which people, MPs especially, who do wrong, can be forced to quit, especially by their parties. They can go independent, but many of them, in fact, I think nearly all of them, tend to be determined to stick around until the next election, and there's limited things that anybody can do about that.
And Polly, according to the Daily Telegraph, female Tories in particular are demanding that he's expelled from the party, but according to their article again, he's refusing to quit.
Well, you can understand why he wants the opportunity for his case to be heard by the parliamentary commissioner. But of course, that has implications for party management. And also, you can understand how women MPs, and Caroline Noakes, Conservative MP, has been very outspoken about this, feel like there is this widespread cultural problem in the Conservative Party. And when it comes to culture in an organisation, essentially what you permit, you promote. And so this hesitation feels, I think, to some women, particularly in the Conservative Party, like tolerance, like acceptance of this kind of behaviour. If it was just a one-off, it'd be one thing. But actually, we know this allegation came up at a meeting of the Conservative parliamentarians, where woman after woman after woman was able to tell stories of unacceptable experiences they had had at the hands of their fellow parliamentarians, their peers in the party who were male. So that's why they want this to be dealt with expeditiously. My view, to the point that Henry's just made, is that recall right that constituents have should be much, much more open. People should be able to submit a recall petition, frankly, anytime they feel like, not with a high threshold for the number of signatories you need to get, but you shouldn't have to wait for these sluggish parliamentary procedures. You shouldn't have to wait for the proceedings of our criminal justice system. If constituents of large numbers are furious with MP for conduct like this, they should be able to say, we want a new one.
Yes, and the article says that female Tory MPs, as we've been discussing, they are furious at the way it has been handled by the party whips. So not at all pleased with how it has been handled. And I think there's, who is it? Daisy Cooper, the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Democrats, said the Prime Minister should tell Mr Parish to resign immediately. Do you think that might follow, that might be the case, Henry, that we might be hearing that the Prime Minister has asked him to resign?
It might. Of course, the Prime Minister has no power to make him do it. I think the flip side of the sort of the limited power that the Tory party has to kick any MP out of the House of Commons, which is proper, we should say. It wouldn't be right if any party had the ability to actually kick an MP out. But it does mean that Boris Johnson could just withdraw the whip permanently and never let him back in. The Conservative Party's internal disciplinary procedures and its own criteria for membership and the whip are not subject to the findings of a House of Commons commissioner. So I think it's important that whilst Mr Parish gets his day in court, as it were, it's important to remember that Boris Johnson doesn't need to wait for Catherine Stone to take action himself. If he decides that this behaviour was unacceptable, it is entirely within his gift to make an example, to say that this is completely unacceptable, and to withdraw the whip and say that whatever happens, Mr Parish will not contest the next election as a Conservative MP. Now, he might not choose to do that. He might choose to wait for the Parliamentary Commission of Standards to report, but he does have that power, and he will therefore be accountable for whether or not he does or doesn't decide to use it.
Yes, and Polly, it's yet another inquiry that we are faced with, and I suppose embarrassing for the Prime Minister, because he's also facing the inquiry, a different topic, but it speaks to the culture
I
in
think
the
I think
Commons?
it does. There is that sort of decadent decline and fall kind of vibe that you get, unfortunately, from the Conservative government. And that's tragic because we really need a good government. James Forsyth, a Spectator columnist, was writing today about, that sense that the government isn't capable of doing anything, of achieving anything, because all of its attention is focused on these kind of inquiries and the scandals and the party management. And, it just feels like they are absolutely missing in action from the political agendas that matter most, like the cost of living crisis, which is, pushing millions and millions of our citizens to their absolute financial limit. And what's the government doing? It's like debating porn. It matters, but it feels like they have to get a grip on the culture and the morality of their own party if they want to be able to govern. And the problem with Boris Johnson as a leader is that he is somebody who has got away with all sorts of behaviour, cheating on his partners, making slurs against people, making jokes that, others would consider too blue or too inappropriate for kind of parliamentary standards. So it's quite hard, I think, for him to be the face of a cultural change.
And the eyes moved on to the problem of MPs' conduct overall, suggesting that victims of various accusations, they are finding it difficult to come forward and actually bring them out into the open. So almost bullied into submission, and perhaps we're not hearing the half of the story. Henry?
Yeah, the stuff touched on in the eye is actually really interesting because it highlights a real difficulty and tension when it comes to the disciplinary procedures and the investigative procedures which have been put in place in the House of Commons. Because Liam Byrne, the story about Liam Byrne is basically that the ICGS, which is the independent complaints body that's been set up to investigate these issues in Parliament, when his staff complained to the ICGS, he was told who they were and what their complaints were. Now, they were apparently told, wrongly as it turned out, that they were going to be anonymous. So you now have this question, because on the one hand, you want people to feel safe and empowered to come forward and make complaints against MPs who are quite powerful people. But on the other hand, an MP will say, and again, this ICGS actually applies to staff as well. So the people who have claims made against them will say that they have the right, surely, to know the evidence that's being put to them. And the fact of the matter is that unless you're some kind of omnipest, if you are given detailed accounts that you did X to somebody in these circumstances, you will be able to work out who it is that's making the complaint anyway. So there is a tension between making sure that you've got adequate protection for people so they can make complaints and offering adequate recourse to justice for people against whom complaints are made, who have the right to know the evidence that's being made against them. And it's clear that the House of Commons hasn't yet got that right, but I don't think there's an easy way to reconcile those two competing demands.
Polly, are you surprised that Westminster staff are claiming to be afraid to report abuse?
No, I think it's in the nature of the power relationship that you can very often have in an MP's office. An MP is essentially a very small employer, perhaps employing 3 or 4 people. They are sort of protected from most systems of accountability other than general elections. But because they've been put there by the voters, there isn't a board you can report them to, though there is now this system. They haven't got a manager. They've only got the party. So the sense that you are basically at the whim of this potentially brilliant, potentially awful boss as a junior staffer is I think, really problematic. And the parties have an important role to play there because they can provide some mechanism, support, and crucially for kind of exit, for people to be able to move on to other jobs and not feel like that kind of precarity of trying to climb up the political ladder and not wanting an MP to be bad-mouthing you. That's something that only the parties who have an infrastructure of kind of other political jobs have any hope of offering in order to get around this kind of like fundamental challenge that MPs in the end get to keep their job unless the voters get rid of them.
OK, Polly and Henry for the moment, thank you.